Soviet Union, March 1943. Wehrmacht. Report 324B. Tiger tank found abandoned in Factory Complex 12. Engine running. Radio operational. Crew compartment contained 5 skeletal remains in uniform. Dated 1973. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale of a Tiger crew who discovered that in the ruins of Kharkov, some wars never end. They just wait for fresh soldiers to claim. The Third Battle of Kharkov raged through the winter of 1943 as Nazi Germany launched a desperate counteroffensive to reclaim the strategic city from Soviet forces. Among the units deployed was the elite Schwere Panzer-Abteilung 503, their Tiger warrior tanks spearheading the assault through the frozen urban wasteland. But in the official Wehrmacht records, there exists a peculiar entry: a single Tiger crew that disappeared for 72 hours, only to be found in a way that defied all rational explanation. Unteroffizier Karl Weiss stood in the commander's cupola of Tiger 324, his experienced eyes scanning the snow-covered ruins of Kharkov's industrial district. The February air bit through his thick wool uniform at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, but the cold wasn't what made him uneasy. Something about this sector felt wrong. The unnatural silence, the absence of even the distant sounds of combat that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Below him, the crew went through their pre-patrol checks with practiced efficiency. Feldwebel Dietrich Meyer, the gunner, calibrated the gun sight with methodical precision. Gefreiter Otto Lehmann, their young loader, muttered what might have been a prayer as he arranged the 88mm shells in their racks. Hauptgefreiter Ernst Baumann sat ready at the driver's position, while Funker Hans Richter monitored the radio with unwavering attention. "Command reports partisan activity in Factory Complex 12, Richter announced, his voice tight with tension. "We're to sweep and clear, maintain radio contact throughout." Weiss acknowledged with a grunt, but something about the order nagged at him. Factory Complex 12 had been cleared 3 times in the past week, yet reports of movement, of shadows darting between the buildings, persisted. More disturbing were the rumors of German patrols entering the complex and emerging changed, their stories contradicting each other, their eyes haunted by something they couldn't or wouldn't describe. "Start her up," Weiss ordered, forcing confidence into his voice. The massive Maybach engine roared to life, its familiar sound somehow hollow in the dead air of the ruins. As they began to move, Weiss caught sight of strange markings carved into a nearby wall, symbols that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision, but became maddeningly indistinct when viewed directly. None of them knew it then, but Tiger 324 was rolling toward its final patrol. In 72 hours, the tank would be found, its engine still running, containing a mystery that would haunt military records for decades to come. And somewhere in the frozen ruins of Kharkov, time itself was beginning to unravel. As Tiger 324 ground its way through the snow-choked streets, the ruins of Kharkov's Factory Complex 12 loomed before them like a mouthful of broken teeth against the steel gray sky. Unteroffizier Weiss noticed something odd about the tank tracks in the snow. They seemed to lead both into and out of the complex simultaneously, despite no other units being assigned to this sector. "Radio check," Weiss ordered, fighting down a surge of unease. Funker Richter's response came through with unnatural clarity. "All frequencies clear, Herr Unteroffizier," though Richter hesitated, adjusting his headset. "There's something strange. I'm picking up German transmissions, but they're old. Combat reports from weeks ago when we first took the factory. The massive tiger." I crawled deeper into the complex, its tracks crunching through a layer of fresh snow that seemed to deaden all sound. Through his periscope, Weiss studied the factory walls. The strange symbols he'd noticed earlier appeared here too, crude markings that looked almost like German letters, but twisted somehow, as if written by someone who'd only seen the alphabet in mirrors. "Movement, 2 o'clock!" Meyer called from the gunner's position. Weiss swung his cupola, but saw only swirling snow between the buildings. Yet something about the way it moved felt deliberate, almost purposeful. "Halt!" Weiss commanded. The tank ground to a stop, its engine idling. In the sudden quiet, they all heard it. The sound of boots crunching through snow, circling their tank. But the noise seemed to come from above them, as if someone was walking across thin air. Young Lehman crossed himself, whispering, "Just like the stories, the ones about Factory 12, about the crews who came back wrong." "Steady!" Weiss snapped, but Richter suddenly jerked in his seat, ripping off his headphones. "The radio," he said, his voice shaking. It's us. I'm hearing our own voices, giving patrol reports, but we haven't made any yet." Weiss was about to respond when a familiar sound cut through the air, the distinctive grinding of Tiger tank tracks. Through his vision port, he watched in disbelief as another Tiger Y emerged from the swirling snow. Its side number was clearly visible, 324. "Impossible," Meyer breathed. That's our tank." The other Tiger stopped, its turret slowly traversing toward them. In the commander's cupola, Weiss saw a figure that made his blood run cold, a man in a Wehrmacht tank commander's uniform, wearing his own face, but with eyes that held 30 years of horror. The apparition of their own tank vanished into the swirling snow, leaving the crew of Tiger 324 in stunned silence. Weiss ordered an immediate withdrawal, but as Baumann engaged the engine, the massive tank shuddered and sank several inches into what should have been solid concrete. "Tracks caught on something," Baumann reported, gunning the Maybach engine. The sound echoed strangely off the factory walls, coming back distorted, as if they were hearing it from the bottom of a deep well. "Comrade Lieutenant," Richter suddenly said in perfect Russian, his voice unnaturally deep. "The factory, it remembers." The radio operator's eyes had gone glassy, fixed on something none of them could see. "Richter, what the hell?" Meyer reached for him, but Weiss barked a warning. "Don't touch him!" The commander had seen this before, during the retreat from Moscow. Soldiers who'd gone beyond fear into something else. Something that wore their faces but spoke with other voices. Those men never lasted long. Through his periscope, Weiss surveyed the factory walls. The strange symbols he'd noticed earlier had multiplied, covering every surface like a cancerous growth. Some were definitely German letters now, forming words that made his eyes hurt. "Still here, and always here, and again and again." "Sir," Lehman's voice cracked as he pointed to the ammunition rack. "The shells. Look at the manufacture dates." Weiss felt his throat constrict. Each 88mm round bore a stamp. Produced in Königsberg, 1973. But that was impossible. Königsberg was a Soviet city now, had been since 45, wasn't it? A hollow tapping sound began inside the turret wall. Tap, 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 like someone knocking from inside the armor. Meyer swung the turret, tracking the noise, but it always stayed just ahead of the gun's movement, always out of reach. "The days are wrong here," Richter continued in Russian, his hands moving across his radio dials with mechanical precision. "Time bleeds in the factory. The wars never end. They just layer, like ice on a frozen lake." Static burst from the radio. resolving into a familiar voice. Weiss's own voice, reading coordinates for a fire mission. But the grid numbers were wrong, mapping to points that didn't exist or hadn't existed yet, or had existed too many times. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. In the driver's compartment, Baumann screamed. A hand, desiccated, wearing a Wehrmacht ring dated 1973, had emerged from his viewport, reaching for his throat. Richter stood up suddenly, his movement jerky and unnatural. "They're calling us," he said, half in German, half in Russian. "The other crews, the other us." Before anyone could stop him, he opened his hatch and was yanked upward into the swirling snow, leaving only his headphones, still crackling with voices from battles that hadn't happened yet. "Battle shock," Meyer insisted, his knuckles white on the gun controls. "Like the boys from Stalingrad, the cold, the stress." But his voice trailed off as he stared at Richter's empty seat, the headphones still swaying gently, though there was no breeze inside the tank. Weiss fought to maintain control. "Baumann, status report." The driver was breathing heavily, rubbing his throat where the ghostly hand had grabbed him. "Engine's running, but..." Baumann swallowed hard. "The gauges, sir. They're showing readings from different times. Oil pressure from 10 minutes ago. Temperature from next week. Fuel level..." He stopped, his face draining of color. "The fuel gauge is showing numbers from 1973. A distant explosion rattled the tank. Through his periscope, Weiss saw flashes of combat, but they were wrong somehow. Soviet T-34s from 1943 trading fire with German Leopard tanks that wouldn't exist for decades. Soldiers in uniforms from different eras moving through the ruins, all fighting their own private wars in the same cursed space. "We need to move," Weiss ordered, but Meyer's response chilled him to the bone. "Sir, look at the T-34 directly ahead." The Soviet tank sat motionless in the snow, its hatches open. Inside, the crew remained at their stations, perfectly preserved, their hollow eye sockets staring forward, their uniforms decades old, yet somehow still crisp, like they'd been waiting there for 30 years, trapped in the moment of their death. "I saw this already," Lehman whispered, loading another shell with trembling hands. "Yesterday, or tomorrow, I saw us firing at the same T-34. We hit it. We didn't hit it. We will hit it, over and over." A familiar sound made them all freeze. The distinct metallic clang of somebody climbing their tank's hull, boots on steel, moving toward Richter's open hatch. Weiss raised his head to look. "No!" Meyer grabbed his commander's arm. "Sir, that's how we lost Richter. It's what they want. Don't you see? The factory's not haunted. It's hunting, using our own tactics against us." Through the gunner's sight, Meyer suddenly spotted something that defied explanation. Their own Tiger tank, crew included, engaging in a firefight with Soviet forces. But the turret number was wrong. It was reversed, like a mirror image. And inside the commander's cupola, Weiss's doppelganger was staring directly at them, mouthing words they could almost understand. The radio crackled. "Tiger 324. This is Tiger 324. Their own voices echoed back, distorted by static and time. "We've been here before. We're here now. We'll always be here. The factory. It needs crews." The interior of Tiger 324 had become a nightmare of shifting shadows and impossible angles. Rust crept across the walls like living things, then vanished, then reappeared decades older. The crew's breath frosted in air that couldn't decide which winter it belonged to. "Movement!" Meyer called out, his voice cracking. "T-34, 11 o'clock. But sir, something's wrong with the crew." Weiss looked through his periscope. The Soviet tank sat motionless in the killing zone, its hatches open. Inside, he could see the crew frozen in position. Not dead, not alive, but suspended in a moment that had happened before and would happen again. Their hollow eyes stared forward, uniforms pristine despite the decades of frost coating their skin. "I can't." Bauman's voice shook as he gripped the controls. "The pedals, they're changing under my feet. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're—" His words cut off in a strangled gasp as the driver's viewport showed him something only he could see. Lehman had stopped loading shells, his eyes fixed on the ammunition rack. The dates are changing. 1943, 1973, 1943. They're all the same shell, just existing at different times. A sound came from outside, boots on steel, moving with purpose across their hull. But the footsteps echoed wrongly, coming from above and below simultaneously, as if someone was walking on every possible version of their tank at once. "No more," Bauman whispered. Then louder, "No more." Before anyone could stop him, he yanked his hatch open. "Bauman, don't!" Weiss lunged for him, but it was too late. The driver pulled himself halfway out of the hatch, then stopped. His scream wasn't quite human. Ghostly hands, dozens of them, each wearing the same Wehrmacht ring with different dates, reached down from the swirling snow. They grabbed Bauman's arms, his shoulders, his throat. The hands belonged to other versions of himself, each one trapped in their own temporal loop, each one having made the same fatal mistake. "Help me!" Bauman shrieked as the hands pulled him upward. "Sir, please! I don't want to become like the others! I don't want to!" His words cut off as he vanished into the white void above. The hatch slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Where Bauman had sat, frost began forming on the controls, spelling out words in his handwriting. "Still here, always here. The factory must have its crews." Through the periscope, Weiss watched in horror as the interior of their tank began to shift and age. Decades of rust appeared and disappeared like waves, and in their seats, their own skeletal remains slumped forward, uniforms crumbling to dust, then reforming, then crumbling again in an endless cycle. Only 3 of them remained in Tiger 324 now. The silence after Bauman's disappearance was broken only by the soft static of the radio, whispering fragments of battles past and future in their own voices. "We have to move," Meyer said, his hands trembling on the gun controls. "Sir, give the order. We have to." He stopped, staring at his reflection in the gunner's scope. His face flickered between young and old, flesh and bone, 1943 and 1973. Lehman had begun scratching numbers into the turret wall with a shell casing. "It's a pattern," he muttered. "Every 30 years. The factory calls new crews. But they're all us. They've always been us." Weiss tried to raise command on the radio, but each frequency played back only their own voices from different timelines, some begging for help, others warning them to stay away, all of them trapped in Factory Complex 12's endless loop. Through his periscope, Weiss watched as the world outside shifted like a malfunctioning film reel. Snow fell upward. Battles played out in reverse. Their own Tiger tank appeared and disappeared, each time more corroded, each time crewed by older versions of themselves. "Sir," Meyer's voice cracked with terror. "The T-34. It's changing." The Soviet tank they'd seen earlier was transforming before their eyes. Its steel hull aged decades in seconds, then renewed itself, then aged again. But its crew remained constant, skeletal figures locked in their positions, their hollow eye sockets tracking Tiger 324's every movement. "They're not just dead," Lehman whispered. "They're waiting for us to join them, to become part of the factory's collection. A new sound cut through their mounting panic, the distinct mechanical whir of their turret rotating. But neither Meyer nor Lehmann had touched the controls. The turret was moving on its own, turning to face another Tiger I that had materialized from the temporal storm outside. In its commander's cupola stood Weiss himself, 30 years older, his uniform reduced to tatters, his eyes holding the madness of 3 decades trapped in the factory's loop. The other Weiss raised a gloved hand, pointing at them. No, not at them, at something behind them. Meyer turned around slowly, then screamed. Their own shadows had begun peeling away from the walls, taking 3-dimensional form. Each shadow wore their faces, but twisted by time and horror, reaching for them with hands that had clawed at these same walls for 30 years. "Don't you understand?" Their shadows spoke in unison. "We never left. We never leave. The factory must have its crews." Meyer was the first to break. As their shadows closed in, he lunged for his hatch, trying to escape the way Baumann had. The shadows caught him mid-motion, their time-worn hands pulling him into an embrace that aged him 30 years in seconds. His scream started young and ended ancient, his body crumbling to dust that somehow still moved, still reached for the controls he'd operated for 3 decades of subjective time. The factory. Lehmann's voice shook as he watched his own shadow approach. It's not just a place. It's a collector of crews, of moments, of wars that never end. His shadow touched him, and Weiss watched in horror as loader and shadow merged, becoming something that existed in multiple times at once, endlessly loading shells for battles that had already been fought and were yet to come. Alone now, Weiss faced his older self through the periscope. The other Weiss mouthed words that he finally understood. "We have always been here. We will always be here. The factory must have its crews." Weiss felt time slip around him like sand through an hourglass. He saw himself, dying in this seat 1,000 times, living in this moment forever, commanding a tank that existed in all times at once. The factory had them now, had always had them, would always have them. With his last moment of linear time, he scratched a message into the radio panel. "We have been here before." 3 days later, a Wehrmacht recovery team found Tiger 324 in Factory Complex 12. The engine was still running, the radio still operational, though it broadcast only static and what sounded like distant voices speaking in reverse time. Inside, they found 5 skeletons in Wehrmacht uniforms, perfectly preserved despite appearing to be decades old. The tank's log showed an impossible date, March 15th, 1973. Most disturbing were the dozens of identical messages scratched into every surface, each in the same handwriting but dated years apart. "We have been here before." The recovery team noted something else. Despite the heavy snow, there were no tracks leading to or from the tank. It was as if Tiger 324 had simply materialized there, or perhaps had always been there, waiting to be found. Factory Complex 12 was abandoned shortly after, deemed too unstable for occupation. But in the years that followed, Soviet forces reported strange sightings. A Tiger tank that appeared during snowstorms, its crew visible through the viewports, sometimes flesh, sometimes bone, sometimes something in between. They say that if you listen carefully during winter nights, you can still hear its engine and the voices of its crew, eternally manning their station in a war that never ends. For in the ruins of Kharkov, some battles are fought not just across territories, but across time itself. And Factory Complex 12 must always have its crews. If this tale from the War Maestro's archive has left you checking the dates on your belongings, you're ready to dive deeper into our collection. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss the next classified file. After all, some stories are waiting decades to be told. Hit that notification bell. Time may be fluid in Factory Complex 12, but you'll want to be present when our next dark revelation surfaces. Share this account with fellow history enthusiasts who understand that some military mysteries are better left classified, but we'll uncover them anyway. Leave a comment below. Have you ever experienced time acting strangely during your service? Or perhaps you've encountered places where the past refuses to stay buried. Remember, every military unit needs its crew, and the War Maestro's archive needs witnesses like you. Some stories are eternal, and now you're part of this one.